Hello there. Before getting into the video, I wanted to give a quick shout out to the documentary Out in the Ring by director Ry Levy. This is a documentary that came out at a film festival a few years ago, and while unfortunately I'm unable to find a link that lets you watch the entire documentary, there is a trailer on the Out in the Ring website that kind of gives you an insight into just how important and how in-depth this documentary is. This documentary goes into detail about what it was like being queer in pro wrestling back in the day, and also the different strides that pro wrestling has made today to allow queer wrestlers to be represented on screen. I just wanted to give that quick shout out because it is a wonderful resource, and unfortunately I haven't heard a lot about it outside of the research that I did for this video. So if you're able to watch the whole thing, I highly suggest going and checking it out. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the video. Let me begin by saying this. You cannot untangle professional wrestling and queerness. To completely strip queerness from professional wrestling is to try and change the sport in its entirety, or to deny the inherent queerness of entertainment as a medium. Though many have tried to distance professional wrestling and the queer influence, none have really succeeded in doing more than shining a spotlight on the intertwined cultures of wrestling and the LGBTQ community. It isn't surprising, given that wrestling as a sport originates some 15,000 years ago and was primarily attributed to the Greeks, who intertwined male homosexuality with sports. In ancient Greece, most sports were seen as a way to measure male excellence. Wrestling holds a very special place in that history, given the inherent queerness of naked men attempting to submit one another. This is inherently queer, not just because of how it appears to modern audiences, but also in the context of how the ancient Greeks saw sexual relationships. To the Greeks, who were notoriously tolerant of homosexuality until the popular acceptance of Christianity around 4 AD, a sexual relationship was not gendered. Rather, they concerned themselves with who was dominant and who was submissive in a relationship. Though when the relationship was heterosexual, it was often assumed the woman would take the submissive role. When the relationship was homosexual, there were more questions which one could act out in wrestling, grappling for the dominant role both in sport and in bed. Some may argue that Greek homosexuality was separate from the origins of wrestling, which is partially true, but let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. To the Greeks, male relationships formed the crux of society. Among soldiers, the elite, mentors and mentees, and even ancient myth, homosexuality was not just normalized, but respected. The two concepts, while not solely existing because of the other, were intertwined in many aspects. So, why did I just give you a very brief, very simple overview of ancient Greek wrestling? It isn't because I feel that I often have to remind people that most modern-day sports were formed in a sexually tolerant culture, but because wrestling, specifically, was queer, though it was reserved to men exclusively. I will also be covering other queerness, such as that between women and the queerness of gender, later on in the video. I also mentioned the queer roots of wrestling because, as far back as most people can remember, professional wrestling has made every attempt to distance itself from its own inherent queerness. So, what is queer about modern wrestling, given that pro wrestling is a far different sport than what the ancient Greeks participated in? Gone are the open-minded days where homosexuality wasn't taboo, as well as the days where women were barred from traditional sport. Nowadays, with pro wrestling specifically, You have over-the-top characters telling fabricated stories, wearing outlandish costumes, doing fake spots. There are literal zombies. Sometimes Snoop Dogg is there. But make no mistake, pro wrestling is just as queer as wrestling has always been, if not more so than it has ever been. After all, with the addition of an entertainment value, you have flamboyant characters wearing campy costumes. Even the most macho, heterosexual men don tassels and frills and bright leotards. For example, think about your favorite wrestlers from the 80s and 90s and the things that they came to the ring in, and try to tell me that they weren't absolutely serving. Hulk Hogan came out in bright yellow spandex and teeny tiny shorts. Once in the ring, he did his classic spot where he shreds off his shirt to reveal oiled up, tanned muscles, and was lauded by men around the world for his physique. Macho Man Randy Savage, a literal macho man, wore bright, colorful tassels along his jacket. And let's never forget the tight purple print leotard. Shawn Michaels has often been made into a queer icon, though this was not his intention, certainly, for some of his club kid outfits, which bordered on pornographic and appealed to both men and women. With characters like this, how exactly could pro wrestling distance itself from the queer community? It tried, absolutely, especially in the 80s and 90s, when American queer culture was fighting for recognition and respect amidst a society that oppressed, politicized, and demonized those who identified as sexually or genderqueer. The WWF, also referred to as the WWE throughout this video, was, and is, perhaps the biggest perpetrator of homophobia and queerphobia in pro wrestling. After all, it was the main televised wrestling program throughout the 80s and the 90s. We're going to spare WCW for the moment. In fact, there's literally so much material to cover concerning WWE and its queerphobia that I'm going to have to break this section down into parts to discuss just a few of the many characters and storylines that targeted the queer community. This will be by no means an exhaustive list. If you have any additional stories that I fail to include, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I just ask that everyone remain respectful. Professional wrestling is drag. This is a sentiment shared many times by modern-day wrestling fans who acknowledge the performative nature of wrestling, gender, and queerness. Let's look at this phrase earnestly. A show in which performers portray characters who often identify as men, dress in elaborate costume, often embroidered, sometimes bedazzled, never without flair, to get onto a stage and physically perform an act. These performers wear face paint and makeup to accentuate or obscure their features. Am I describing drag or wrestling? Now, of course, there are noted differences. Pro wrestling is extremely physical and involves impact, interlaced storylines, blood, and violence. While all these attributes can also be attributed to unique drag performances, they are inherent in wrestling. Still, it is undeniable that these two mediums share similarities with the fanfare, performances, extravagance, and their origins in variety show performances. These similarities were never more apparent than with Goldust, a titular character in pro wrestling queer history. Goldust, a character portrayed by Dustin Rhodes, was first introduced as an androgynous wrestler who was inspired by old Hollywood, often making references to classic films and even crafting his image after the Oscars statue. Goldust's calling card was his provocativeness, wherein he would physically flirt with his opponents in order to upset them, catch them off guard, and often leading to him either getting his ass kicked or him stealing a victory from a flustered opponent. Goldust is our first example of queerness in wrestling because he is the most obvious. Whenever a fan is asked to think about queer figures in wrestling, Goldust is likely the first thing that pops into their minds. He was a long-running figure in wrestling, after all, and up until the retirement of the Goldust gimmick in 2019, fans looked to him for classic comedic moments. While Goldust deserves his own dedicated video for all the classic moments that he's given fans, today we're focusing on how the WWF and WWE used him as a way to mock the queer community. You see, Goldust was never taken seriously as a threat. Rather, he was portrayed as an exaggeration of a predatory gay man, non-consensually groping his heterosexual opponents, who would either be mocked for being hit on by another man, or who would be cheered for beating down the sexual freak. Goldust was not seen as a queer icon back in the day. He was deemed the bizarre one, due to attitudes toward the queer community at the time. Queerness, androgyny, and sexual promiscuity in men, after all, was seen as bizarre. Throughout his career, Goldust would be used as a way to mock the queer community. In a classic match with Rowdy Roddy Piper, Goldust would be beaten, bruised, and humiliated until, ultimately, his gold latex suit would be stripped off to reveal him wearing women's lingerie, a tactic used to both humiliate him and to put a freak show on display, while Piper continued to beat on him. He would later be paired with Booker T, in which most of his comedy centered around innuendos in which he would, sometimes inadvertently, hit on Booker T, only for Booker to reject him to the laughter of the crowd. Goldust would inevitably become a fan favorite, much to the WWE's and Dustin Rhodes' genuine surprise. Slowly, his perverted persona was phased out, but his queerness was still used as a way to frame him as a freak and a weirdo all throughout the rest of his career. His appearance hardly changed. Wearing long blonde wigs, elaborate makeup, and full latex suits, he never fully shed the drag queen persona that had first attracted fans to him, at first because they loved mocking a freak, and later because, as attitudes towards the queer community shifted, he was endearing, strange, kind, and some in the queer community decided to take him in as an icon. In Dustin's defense, he did not intend to portray Goldust as a mockery of the queer community. When he was first approached with the gimmick, he admits today that he did not know what androgyny was. It is assumed by many people that Vince, who pitched the gimmick to Dustin, was the one who wanted to create a character to mock the queer community. After all, it wouldn't be the first time that he would do this. Before we get into that, though, I want to make an important note that Dustin Rhodes, while having portrayed a character that was used to mock the LGBT community, is a staunch ally nowadays. This is exemplified by his support for his trans stepson, especially after his son was attacked in a hate crime. While Dustin seems to be, shall we say, a bit undereducated about the queer community and the impact that Goldust had, both positive and negative, he is a supporter of trans rights and the LGBT community nonetheless. There is a wonderful article titled The WWE's Road to Hate that I will link in the description, which first introduced me to perhaps one of the more egregious, despicable, queer-phobic gimmicks crafted up by Vince McMahon himself. This gimmick being adorable Adrian Adonis, portrayed by Keith Frank. Adonis was a flamboyant, overtly homosexual character. There were no censors, no dancing around it. He literally said he was gay on TV. But this was not done with a sense of pride. For one thing, Keith Frank was a heterosexual man, so far as we know, and for another, Adonis was a far cry from a respected babyface. His appearance was that of every offensive queer stereotype that existed in the 1980s, wearing messy makeup, strange trinkets, walking around with limp wrists, and acting overtly effeminate and exaggeratory. He was a mockery of the queer community, from the way he looked to the way he spoke, and was often positioned as the villain because of his effeminate nature. To make matters worse, Vince McMahon himself masterminded this persona in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, capitalizing on a hatred and pathological fear of gay men at the time. Vince, who threw his performers into the ring and rejoiced when crowds would chant homophobic slurs or hold up signs saying awful, offensive things that would get them thrown out of arenas today, crafted the Adrian Adonis character only to fire Keith Frank shortly thereafter, leading to many assuming the gimmick was handed to Frank as a punishment of some sort. With the head of the company punishing wrestlers by forcing them to portray queer stereotypes, it is no wonder that the WWF and WWE clung to homophobia for a cheap pop for so many years. God, I'm gonna have to censor like half of this section. Not because Shawn Michaels did anything extreme, violent, or disgusting, but because a major reason why Shawn is included in this video is because of the reactions he elicited and sometimes encouraged. Shawn Michaels, once he shed the rocker persona and donned what most fans remember as his most iconic character of his career, beginning in the mid to late 90s, was controversial as he was loved. His outfits were outlandish, his hair was flowing, his butt was there, so very there most of the time. Because of this, and because of his over-the-top personality and boyishly good looks, along with his in-ring chemistry with many of his co-workers, he was often on the receiving end of homophobic chants by fans. On several occasions during his run from 92 to 98, fans would cheer their favorites, such as Shawn is gay, or Shawn's a... While Shawn Michaels would often retort these chants with witty one-liners, or by just outright kissing his tag partner Triple H, this did not deter the WWF from encouraging this behavior from fans. They did this by having other wrestlers echo fan sentiments. In an unfortunately unforgettable segment with Bret Hart, the Hitman said the H in HBK stood for homo, and admonished Shawn several times within about 2 minutes, using that word over and over and over. And this wasn't the only time Bret went in on some pretty anti-gay commentary on Shawn. In an open letter to Shawn Michaels in 1997, he makes several remarks about Shawn and Hunter being boyfriends, being comfortable eating bananas together, which harkens back to a classic DX segment where Shawn and Hunter poked fun at rumors about them being gay by deep-throating bananas together. Honestly, kind of iconic. Now, none of this to say that Shawn Michaels and Triple H are queer icons. First of all, they're two straight men with their fair share of controversy. Second, Shawn and Hunter often made jabs and jokes about fellow wrestlers being queer, up through his second iteration as the born-again Shawn Michaels. I recall as a child watching Raw during the mid-2000s and hearing these jokes, then watching Shawn and Hunter roll their eyes and say, not that there's anything wrong with that. In 2012, Shawn Michaels came under fire for a tweet, which was in response to a fan mocking his hairline, stating, "Another man obsessed with my hair. #homo." His subsequent apology was interlaced with statements that people were being too sensitive. Now, this isn't to say that Shawn Michaels is a raging homophobe. However, his character was a representation of queer anxieties and a desperation to separate oneself from what was a taboo identity while also participating in a queer industry. Even straight men, not doing any sort of queer gimmick, were attacked, and they then attempted to deflect the attention by being overly macho or homophobic themselves. Hear that, Ultimate Warrior? But Shawn and Triple H were not the only wrestling stable to be accused of being romantic partners. In fact, WWE would present us with yet another tag team, whose storyline culminated in a scene that showed just how outdated WWE's perception of the queer community was. Chuck Palumbo and Billy Gunn were part of a notorious storyline in 2001 and 2002, wherein they feigned a developing, flourishing relationship. The two men showed themselves falling in love, growing physically affectionate in the ring, starting to match each other's hair and clothes, and the two even went so far as to actively call each other life partners. This was not seen, at least entirely, as a mockery of the queer community. In fact, WWE had the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD, help the storyline gain media coverage, encouraging viewership and appearing very much like the company had changed their colors, literally. This, however, was a lie. Turns out, WWE had actually misrepresented the storyline to GLAAD in order to get the organization's help with promoting their product to a newer audience. You see, Billy and Chuck were set to get married in-ring on SmackDown in 2002, a move that WWE had pitched to GLAAD to help cinch their collaboration. Only WWE had outright lied to GLAAD about the resolution of this storyline, promising that Billy and Chuck would actually be married and actually be a representation of the gay community. Though this representation likely wouldn't be enough today, as the two men were still seen as a joke because of their effeminate personalities, the gay stereotypes they represented, and the fact that they were literally two straight men. Back in the day, however, this was seen as progressive. Until the storyline actually resolved, with Billy and Chuck putting a stop to the ceremony and claiming that things had gone too far, that the two of them were actually straight, and this had all been one big joke. Of course, WWE faced backlash from GLAAD about this. Even today, fans recall the angle and explain how they were either relieved that the storyline didn't go any deeper, or were hurt that the whole thing had been a big joke. The attitude towards the queer community was changing, and WWE, it seemed, wasn't going to change until fans criticized them enough. While homophobia was heavily centered around male relationships and gender presentation, let's not leave out the women. Homophobia was very unique when it came to women in wrestling. Instead of it being mocked, exaggerated, or demonized, homosexuality between women was instead fetishized. Women kissing on screen was meant to entice fans, to get the male viewership tuned in. We had things like women wrestling in mud, women wrestling in bikinis, women feeling each other up. None of this was seen as homosexual, really. Even queer women today might not call what Tori Wilson and Dawn Marie had going on gay. Instead, this was women acting out what Vince McMahon thought queer relationships between women looked like in order to satisfy the male need to see two women going at it. It was made by and for the male gaze. Thus, female queerness went unrepresented when it wasn't being fashioned as some sort of strange, perverse fetish. In my next video, I will discuss the ways in which pro wrestling has changed in terms of acceptance and portrayal of queer wrestlers. This video was a bit depressing, and that's because that was the state of pro wrestling, up until the tides began to change in the mid-2000s. While I'm excited to show how much wrestling has grown, I would be remiss not to explain why it's such a big deal that we're finally embracing not just queerness in general, but the inherent queerness of pro wrestling. You'll also notice something significant in the follow-up to this video. WWE is markedly absent from those taking strides in queer representation in pro wrestling. While the company has teamed with many anti-hate organizations in the modern day, and showcases many openly queer wrestlers, when it comes to gimmicks and what is actually shown on TV, WWE has all but cleansed themselves of the queer community. Perhaps this is for the best, though. Given their track record, I'm not sure WWE can be trusted with a tasteful storyline portraying same-sex love interests or genderqueer wrestlers. Hell, I don't even trust them to let a wrestler say they're queer on air. I don't have to worry, really, as this is extremely unlikely to happen anyway. The ancient history of queerness in wrestling is fascinating. The more recent history, depressing. But it is important to reflect back on where we came from in order to appreciate how much we've grown, and that is especially true with pro wrestling. Let me close out by saying this. While attitudes towards queerness were distinctly negative throughout pro wrestling's televised history, there were several queer wrestlers who simply didn't come out until they felt comfortable. They were, nonetheless, present. These were wrestlers who endured the attitude and admonishments of their own community while working hard towards giving fans an incredible experience. Some of these wrestlers will be mentioned in the second half of this video series. I can only hope that these wrestlers, at least those still living, are able to see how far we've come and appreciate how pro wrestling has grown and changed for the better, as it is now opening its arms to the queer community.